Hi there, welcome to my channel. My name's Emma. I am Canadian and I was looking to start a Canadian true crime channel. I have been digesting, I guess you could say, true crime for years. Ever since I was little. I am the daughter of a law enforcement officer, so runs in my blood a little bit. But especially over the last couple of years, I have been loving true crime YouTube channels, podcasts, articles, books, tons and tons of books. So anything I can find. Sorry, my cat's over here. She might end up in the video. We will see. Basically what I've realized while I've been loving all this true crime content is that there's not a lot of coverage of Canadian true crime. So I wanted to bring a platform about for that sort of coverage. And there's a lot of other unsolved disappearances, unsolved homicides, tons of that sort of stuff here that doesn't really get talked about or doesn't get the coverage that might be necessary to help solve some of it. Specifically, I would love to focus on unsolved crimes as well as missing persons. So this channel is going to be I think fully true crime to start off with, you know, maybe some vlogs, maybe some Q&As, that sort of thing, some more conversational videos. But for the most part, it will be true crime based with the goal of raising awareness about a lot of true crime that occurs in Canada, because I see a lot of coverage of American cases, obviously, a lot of amazing coverage on YouTube of British cases from people like Joshua Miles, Molly Westbrook, Georgia Marie. Like, those are YouTubers who I absolutely love. I binge all of their content all the time. And then in Australia there's a lot of coverage as well. I do hope the lighting's okay here. I am filming with natural light. I'm a university student. I have a break from school currently, so I am home at my parents' house and I wasn't really sure exactly where the best place to film was. Hopefully the lighting is okay. If it's not, I apologize. I do plan on getting some more permanent lighting. I also would like to say that any feedback on this video is welcome as long as it's constructive. You won't offend me regardless, but I do want to know what I could do better, what people liked about this video, what they didn't like. Constructive criticism is great. Things that you loved is great to hear, so I know to keep doing those. I have a tendency to speak very quickly. I know that, and I'm going to try to not do that here, but it's quite possible that it will happen. And if I am talking too fast, if you would prefer that I slow down in future videos, please let me know about that. A general disclaimer, as most true crime YouTubers do, that I don't intend to cause any disrespect to anybody in this video or anybody that I mention in this video or their families. I am simply trying to convey the facts, raise awareness about the case, and that especially applies in this case because it was very, very difficult to research, which I will get into shortly. If I have missed anything, or if I have mispronounced anything or said any of the facts wrong, I do apologize, and feel free to correct me down below, but just in a polite way. And I would also like to just at this point insert a warning that this case does deal with sexual assault and murder of children. And that if that's something that makes you uncomfortable or something that you have a hard time dealing with, I would suggest clicking off of this video now and maybe coming back to my channel for a later video when it's something that you're a little bit more comfortable with, because I don't want to upset anybody with this case. With all of that said, that was quite a long intro. I'm sure I will cut out most of that. We will move on to the video. So today we will be dealing with the case of Leopold Dion. Leopold Dion is a convicted serial killer and sex offender here in Canada. He committed his crimes throughout the 40s, 50s, and into the early 60s. I have seen his name out. He is French, so in Canada we do have a very French area, a French province called Quebec. And this did take place there. I personally am not fluent in French. French is not my first language. I did learn it in school growing up, and I do speak some French, but I am by no means fluent. And some of the pronunciation of names here is a little hard for me to gauge. I have tried to look online, but since this case does take place over 50 years ago, it is a little bit harder for me to find pronunciation on, especially for some of the last names. So I will do my best here. I apologize if any of these names are wrong. But we will start with the name of the perpetrator here. His name is Leopold Dion. I will put everybody's names on the screen as well the first time I mention them, so that you're able to see the spelling if it's a name you're not familiar with, since they aren't necessarily English names here. I've also seen his name as Leopold, like Leopold, but most of the iterations of it have been Leopold, like how I will use it here, so that's what we'll use going forward. I will refer to him as both Leopold and Dion throughout the video, back and forth between his first name and his last name, mostly depending on the age. I didn't necessarily feel comfortable using just his last name when we discuss his upbringing and his life as a child, but as we go into more of his crimes and as they get more severe throughout his lifetime, I do want to focus more on using his last name at that point, if that makes sense. So Leopold Dion was born in 1920 in Quebec, in Canada. His father was a sergeant in the army here in the Canadian Armed Forces, and based upon the time period that he was born, I think that it's most likely that his mother, although not mentioned, was a stay-at-home mother. She was a housekeeper. So shortly after his birth, Leopold actually contracted tuberculosis and was put into a hospital institution for recovery from that and to get the proper care that he needed while he was recovering and dealing with tuberculosis. So he was placed in this hospital for his tuberculosis shortly after birth, and this was a hospital that was staffed by nuns. Those were the nurses. So he was taken care of by these nuns in this hospital for the first 11 years of his life. So not just for a couple years or a couple months when he was a baby. He was in this hospital for 11 years, and his parents were only allowed to visit him once a week throughout this entire time. Then shortly before Christmas in his 11th year, he was cleared to be able to go home for the holidays and go home permanently, actually. So shortly before Christmas Day, he went home. He spent Christmas with his parents. He spent Christmas with his younger brother, who was practically a stranger to him at this point in his life. He had been in the hospital since he was born. So he had this wonderful Christmas. He later said that he loved this time with his family, being able to actually be part of a family unit, participate in family activities, to be able to live at home. But exactly 4 days after arriving home for Christmas, Leopold's parents announced that they had decided to separate, and they subsequently put both their sons into an orphanage. So imagine you've been in the hospital for 11 years, you're finally allowed to go home, and you go home for 4 days, and your parents say, you know what, we don't want to be married anymore, we don't know what to do with the kids, let's put them in an orphanage. I'm sure that didn't feel very nice to Leopold or to his brother. That's just, it blows my mind that you come home for 4 days from the hospital and you're sent back to another institution. Yes, it's not a hospital, but it's still not your home. And after 4 days, I would assume that at 11 years old, he would have thought that this had something to do with him. He'd been home for 4 days and suddenly his parents were separating. I'm sure to an 11-year-old that seems personal. Clearly this just wasn't the best start for him in life. I'm not saying any of this information on his background as a way to excuse any of the actions in his life, but I do think that it's safe to say that he didn't have the best childhood or the best introduction to life. So Leopold spent the next 3 years of his life in this orphanage, once again being looked after by nuns, until he was sent back to live with his mother at the age of 14, who still did not really want to be looking after her sons and immediately sent him back to an orphanage. Not to the same one, as they had been the ones to send him to his mother in the first place, probably thinking that his parents were stable enough, or his mother was stable enough to be looking after her own children. So they sent Leopold back to his mother, and she very quickly sent him back to another orphanage, this time still run by the Catholic Church, but this was by a sect of religious brothers, so this was priests rather than nuns. So according to Roland, Leopold's younger brother, who did spend a lot of the years in these orphanages alongside his brother, all Leopold wanted at this time was to be done with the institution life. He wanted out of institutions, and honestly, I don't blame him for that. He had now been in institution since he was born, basically, up until now the age of 14 or 15. And he just really, really wanted a normal life. He didn't want to be in these orphanages. He didn't want to be in a hospital. He wanted a little bit more freedom, and he actually was able to convince the boy's father to take both of them back in and have him look after his sons, which, I know, crazy idea. You should look after your children instead of putting them in an orphanage when you split up with your wife. But that's my own opinion. But at this point, his dad did take in both of his sons again, and they went on to live with their father. But less than a year later, in August 1937, at the age of 17, Leopold had his first run-in with law and law enforcement. On August 31st, 1937, Leopold was convicted of gross indecency. I was unable to find any more information on that conviction. I'm not 100% sure what that means, but some sort of gross indecency, and he spent 4 months in prison for this conviction. 2 years later, at age 19, in 1939, Leopold joined the Canadian Armed Forces, enlisting to fight in World War II. And shortly after joining, however, he was arrested for the rape and attempted murder of a sex worker. All of the articles I read were from the time when this happened, and they did refer to this woman as a prostitute, but here we're going to refer to her as a sex worker. He was arrested for the rape and attempted murder of this woman. He was ultimately acquitted of this attack, but according to the judge who oversaw the case at the time, he said that Leopold only escaped justice due to a lack of evidence, even though he was clearly guilty. Clearly at the time, nobody had any question. They were just unable to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law, and he was acquitted of this crime. I was unable to find any information on whether or not this trial and acquittal ended up in him being discharged from the army at all. There was nothing on that. There was nothing on when he left the army, but I think that we can assume in this case that based on this crime and based on crimes that he committed in the coming year, he didn't serve more than a year, if that, in the Canadian Armed Forces. In April of 1940, so a year after joining the army, Leopold, as well as his younger brother Roland, were charged with the armed rape of a young woman in Pont Rouge, Quebec. They attacked this woman while she was walking along a railroad track just outside of town. They beat her brutally, they sexually assaulted her, and they left her for dead. This woman was fortunately able to survive this attack and report it to police, but she was left with permanent physical and psychological damage. For this attack, Leopold Dion did receive a life sentence, and he was sent to St. Vincent de Paul Penitentiary in Montreal. And from here on out, he does spend a lot of time in this prison. I'm going to refer to it as St. Vincent Penitentiary just because the name is quite long. So it's called St. Vincent de Paul. We're going to refer to it as St. Vincent's. He was sentenced to life in prison in St. Vincent's Penitentiary, and his brother Roland was sentenced to 10 years in prison. I think this is probably the last time we'll talk about Roland in this case. I would like to mention that he was never convicted of another crime following this. By all accounts, he was able to lead a productive and law-abiding life after being released from prison for this crime, so we won't really be coming back to him. Following Leopold's conviction for the 1940 rape and attempted murder, the judge who oversaw his case and handed down his sentence actually wrote a letter to the Federal Remission Service, so the people that were in charge of paroles at the federal level and deciding who was able to be paroled and who wasn't. The judge himself wrote a letter to them, and I'm going to read from my notes here at this point. And he said, "I maintain that he ought to remain in prison for his whole sentence," which was life, "taking into consideration his past record and atrocious nature of the rape of which he was found guilty. I don't think parole should ever be granted." So keep this letter in mind that the judge wrote recommending that parole should never be granted for Leopold Dion. Keep that in mind because we will be coming back to that in a little bit. According to accounts of Dion's time in the penitentiary, he kept to himself for the most part. Obviously, sexual predators are not treated well in prison. They are one of the bottom prisoners. So he wasn't treated very well. He didn't really have friends in prison, but according to people who were incarcerated alongside him and people who worked at the penitentiary at that time, he was, by all accounts, a good prisoner. He had a lot of jobs around the penitentiary. He got on well, he was respectful, and so some of that would contribute to his later parole, which we will get to. So I do want to go into, at this time, a little bit of the history of the Canadian penal system around the 40s, 50s, and into the 60s, so that you have a little bit more of an understanding of what was going on and why some of the events that occur in this case happened. In the late 1930s, a prison reform inquest was commissioned by the Governor General of Canada, and it was recommended that a psychiatrist be placed in each prison. The recommendation stated it is necessary for a full-time psychiatrist to be provided for the larger institutions, and at the least a part-time psychiatrist in the smaller ones. So yes, this seems like a great recommendation. It seems very forward-thinking for the time, but it actually only equated to one psychiatrist for every 1,200 men in federal custody. Despite this recommendation being put in place in the late 30s, there was no full-time psychiatrist at St. Vincent's when Dion arrived, and when he eventually left that prison in 1956, so 16 years later, there was still not a full-time psychiatrist. There was a part-time psychiatrist who did work in the prison. This man worked 5 days a week, half days, but he worked for half the day, 5 days a week, for over 1,000 men that were in this prison. The psychiatrist that worked half-time at St. Vincent's did see Dion, and he did meet with him on a few occasions, but he never administered him any sort of treatment. So what I gathered and what I read from some of the articles was that the psychiatrists in these prisons were so overrun and so overloaded with cases that if somebody walked around fine, they didn't look sick, and they basically acted like a normal person, then they weren't really given any psychiatric treatment. Those who were visibly ill, so people that suffered with something such as schizophrenia, those people would be the ones who were granted access and able to actually receive treatment from these psychiatrists. As I mentioned before, Dion left this prison at St. Vincent's in 1956, and this was due to being paroled after only 16 years of his life sentence. The following year, in 1957, Leopold Dion was sent back to St. Vincent's Penitentiary after being convicted of gross indecency involving a homosexual act with a 15-year-old. So that's what they called it. That's what they called what they sent him back to prison for. However, I'm sure we can all agree that this is sexual assault of a minor. This man was in his 30s, and he sexually assaulted a 15-year-old boy. That's exactly what that is. It should not matter that it was a homosexual act, as was in the conviction, but as we know, homosexuality was illegal at the time, and so that's what he was convicted of. But yes, he assaulted a 15-year-old boy, and he was sent back to prison for that less than a year after being paroled from his life sentence. In 1958, after being sent back to St. Vincent's the previous year, Leopold Dion was transferred to the Kingston Penitentiary in Kingston, Ontario. Sexual psychopaths, which is what Dion was called at this time, weren't seen by psychiatrists at the Kingston Penitentiary. The psychiatrist who worked there at the time said that he did not have the time or resources to treat men with such deep problems. He said that he only had time to see each man once a month at the most, and felt that there was nothing he could do for them with this little time together. So although Leopold did see this man once a month, there was never any treatment given to him. He never received any treatment, or really he wasn't even observed in his sexual behavior, sexual deviancy in his time in the Kingston Penitentiary. Part of the reason that there was such a shortage of psychiatrists in the prisons at this time was that the salary for this job was $5,500 a year. I did plug this into an inflation calculator for the Canadian dollar, and that's still only about $46,000 today. $46,000 is a lot less than what somebody with a psychiatric degree would be making today, and so I can assume that at that time as well, that was not a lot of money, and there wasn't really a large amount of people vying for these positions when they were able to, with their same profession and with their same accreditations, get a job elsewhere that paid more money and that likely was not working with federal prisoners. So it has been questioned, though, whether if Dion had received a higher level of psychiatric assessment while he was in the Kingston Penitentiary, whether he still would have received his next parole. So the cat is coming now. On that note, in 1962, Dion was once again paroled. The parole system he was paroled under had begun in 1959 and resulted in parole being much easier to be granted. From 1959 to 1961, the number of federal inmates paroled increased from 522 in 1959 to almost double that of 1,005 in 1961. So when Dion was paroled in 1962, his case wasn't looked at too closely. They were really focusing on rehabilitation and paroling more prisoners. If you remember, I mentioned a letter earlier that was sent by the judge in the 1940s case to the board that would be overseeing any future paroles. This letter had recommended that Dion never be paroled. That was the gist of it. And to be sent from a federal judge, I would hope that that would have some weight to it. However, it turns out that this letter was never seen by the judge who signed Dion's parole papers in 1962. So later on, in the fall of 1963, when the parole board was asked about why Dion was paroled, a representative said, "Well, we let him out in September, and he didn't go astray until recently," as if that made their decision acceptable. So they released him in 1962, and then less than 18 months later when he was arrested, they said, "Well, yes, we released him, but he didn't go astray until some months after we'd released him, so it's not really our fault. Like, as you can see, he didn't act out right away, so that makes our decision better." Which doesn't make sense and is really just passing the blame off and trying to make themselves look better. At the point of this 1962 parole, Leopold Dion was 42 years old and had already served over 25 years of his life in prison. So now we're going to discuss the murders that Leopold Dion committed. This was surprisingly the area of the case that I had the hardest time researching in terms of the amount of information available. There was not a lot about it. I had to rely primarily on 2 archived newspaper articles, one in English, one in French, and one article from Maclean's magazine, which is a very, very popular, it's been around for decades, it's a Canadian magazine. So there wasn't a lot of information on this. I also want to note, right before getting into this section, that I did read in a few sources that Leopold Dion actually sexually assaulted 21 young boys between his 1962 parole and his 1963 arrest. However, I was unable to verify this, and that fact wasn't mentioned in any of the sources that I felt were most credible, so I have for the most part left that out of the video, but I did want to mention it just in case it is true, and that would then be a very important fact in the case. So Leopold Dion's first victim was 12-year-old Guy Lecnuk. Once again, that's a name that I'm not sure I'm pronouncing right, especially the last name. I am fairly certain that his first name is Guy. I know it is spelt like Guy in English, however in French this would say Guy. And Guy was from Kenogrami, Quebec. Guy was an avid clarinet player, and he did travel weekly into Quebec City on the bus to attend his clarinet lesson at the Conservatoire de Musique du Québec. So that would be the Quebec Music Conservatory. And so he traveled every week on the bus into the city to and from for this lesson. On April 20th, 1963, Guy took his weekly trip into the city. He attended his clarinet lesson, and he was on his way home when he encountered Dion. Dion introduced himself as a photographer and asked if Guy would allow him to take some photos of him. Guy agreed, and Dion drove him to a remote location outside of Quebec City where he sexually assaulted the young boy and strangled him, burying him in a shallow grave. Later on, after his arrest, Dion said that he did not intend to kill Guy, but decided in the moment to do so out of fear of being sent back to the Kingston Penitentiary. And this statement is what makes me question the supposed fact about him assaulting 21 boys, because if this attack on Guy made him so afraid that he would get caught that he felt that he had to kill him, why would that not have happened to all the previous boys before this? Why did he not feel so scared about being sent back to prison that he would have let all of those boys go and not Guy? So that's just my thought process there, and that's why I'm a little bit unsure about that fact about the 21 victims. Dion's second and third victims occurred at the same time. They were two boys, 8-year-old Alain Carrière and 10-year-old Michel Morel, and they were friends. On May 5th, 1963, Dion came across the two boys while they were walking through the Plains of Abraham, which is a historic area in the Battlefields Park in Quebec City. And this particular area of the park is where the Battle of the Plains of Abraham took place in 1759. So the two boys were walking through the park together when Dion came across them and once again introduced himself as a photographer. He used the same ruse. He convinced the boys to leave the park with him. He drove them in the direction of Saint-Raymond-de-Portneuf, which is a city about 63 kilometers, so 39 miles, give or take, northwest of Quebec City. He took these two boys to a rundown abandoned cabin just outside of Saint-Raymond-de-Portneuf, where he carried on the photographer ruse by taking photos of the boys. In actuality, this was fully a ruse. There was not even film in his camera, so he wasn't even taking pictures of them to keep for later or anything like that. He was solely using the camera as a way to lure these children out of the city and to this remote location with him. According to Dion, after hours of abusing and torturing these boys inside the cabin, he tied up Alain inside. He took Michel outside, where he strangled him, and after killing Michel, he then went back inside and smothered Alain. After Dion's arrest, when the boys' remains were found, Michel was in fact wearing a makeshift hood over his head, which was held in place with a cord of some sort, and Alain's body was found wrapped in a burlap sack. Dion's fourth and final victim was 13-year-old Pierre Marquis, who he once again used the photographer ruse with. Pierre was swimming at Anse-Foulon, a swimming cove about an hour north of Quebec City, when he met Dion, who promised to pay Pierre in return for taking some photos of him. Pierre, eager for this pocket money, agreed, and he was seen by witnesses leaving the cove with Dion in a 1954 black Vanguard truck. These witnesses would be the last people, aside from Leopold Dion, to ever see Pierre alive. Following his arrest, Dion wrote that after he assaulted Pierre, he told the boy to say his prayers and then strangled him to death. After killing Pierre, Dion went swimming in an attempt to create an alibi for himself, and he then returned to the scene of the crime the next day to bury Pierre's body. Pierre's remains were eventually found only about 400 feet from Guy's remains, the first victim, However, Pierre's remains were buried quite far beneath ground level, clearly in a little bit more of an attempt to hide the body, and the clothes that Pierre was wearing when he disappeared, which was just a bathing suit and a towel, were found nearby to his body and buried under a rock. So those are the 4 murders that we know Leopold Dion committed, and I'm now going to move on to discussing his arrest and his trial. There wasn't a lot of information I could find online about the circumstances that led to his arrest. However, it was stated in a few different sources that it was another boy who Leopold had tried to lure into his vehicle with the photographer ruse, who brought the information forward to police and eventually led to Dion's arrest. So I'm not sure exactly how that happened. I don't know if this little boy who brought the information forward knew Dion personally and was able to give his name, or was just able to give a description of his truck, but they did eventually arrest Dion for these 4 disappearances of the young boys, and in his wallet when they found him was a bus ticket that belongs to Pierre, his 4th victim. Due to a lack of evidence in the cases of Guy, Alain, and Michel, Dion was only able to be tried for the abduction and murder of Pierre, his 4th victim. However, Dion did confess while in prison to all 4 of these murders, and so they are attributed to him today. It is known that he is the man responsible for the murder of these 3 boys because he did lead the police to the remains of all 4 of his victims. However, he wasn't tried for the first 3 boys' homicides. During the trial, the Crown based their evidence largely on the testimony of 2 psychiatrists, Dr. Paul Lariviere and Dr. Louis Charles Daoust, who concluded that despite being the victim of complexes and being a sexual pervert, Dion was sane and was therefore fit to stand trial. Dion's defense lawyer, Guy Bertrand, also relied on the testimony of a psychiatrist, Dr. Camille Laurent, who, after examining Dion, said that in his opinion, Dion was insane and not responsible for his actions due to the fact that he was a sexual monster with a human face. So to me, it sounds like all 3 psychiatrists found that he had sexual deviancy, he was a sexual pervert, a sexual monster, whatever they wanted to call it, but where they differed was on whether or not they felt that having these characteristics and having these mental issues around sex meant that you were sane or not. So they all came to this same conclusion about what was wrong with him, but the Crown's 2 psychiatrists concluded that despite all of this, he was sane and was guilty and fit to stand trial. However, the defense lawyer's psychiatrist said that because of all of this, he was not sane. So that's kind of where the difference lies between them, and I tend to side with the Crown psychiatrists. That's exactly how it would be seen today as well, is that yes, he's guilty, he has these problems, but he knew what he was doing. The defense psychiatrist also said that through a process of unfortunate event, Dion had come to be obsessed with sex to such a degree that it was the only driving motivation in his life. He also said that had Dion not been arrested, he would have gone on to much more terrible crimes. As if the murder of these 4 boys was not already enough of a terrible crime. Like, I'm not sure what they were trying to get at there, that what other more terrible crimes he could have committed, because to me, and I think to most of you, that's a pretty terrible crime as it is. So the psychiatrist on the defense's team in general painted Dion as a victim of some sort, calling him the victim of an uncontrollable sexual urge, where he's not a victim. The trial itself was only 2 weeks long, and the jury deliberated for only 15 minutes. And on Friday, the 13th of December, 1963, they came back with a verdict of guilty of capital murder, which at the time carried the death sentence. When Dion was asked if there was anything he wanted to say before the sentence was passed down by the judge, he said, "I have nothing to say. These hands, these damned hands, have taken the lives of 4 children. What I am today, I didn't become myself. I have always said that to those who questioned me. Society should be satisfied with what they have done. 43 years and I have never lived. That's all. So he's trying to blame society for his crimes here. He's trying to say that he was dealt a rough hand and that's why he ended up committing these crimes. The judge, in this case, Judge Lacroix, was not about to take this from Dion. He was not going to let him blame his actions on society as a whole and not take responsibility for them. And he replied by saying, "There are 4 children dead, and these 4 had the right to their lives. You were defended well with much heart and courage. On April 10th, you will be taken to a place determined for your execution, and there you will be hanged by the neck until dead. May God have mercy on your soul." So Dion was sentenced to death for these crimes. The death penalty, as some of you might be thinking, I thought Canada didn't have the death penalty. It doesn't now, but it did in the 60s. The death penalty wasn't fully outlawed until the early 90s, although it stopped being handed out as a sentence in the late 70s. So following his conviction, Dion and his defense lawyer did appeal his death sentence, and it was subsequently commuted to life imprisonment by the Governor General. And Leopold Dion died in prison at the age of 52 in 1972 as a result of being stabbed to death by another inmate. So that's all I have for you on this case today. I know I said at the start of the video that I would want to cover primarily unsolved cases on this channel and missing persons, and that was what I envisioned covering for a first video. However, as I started researching cases and looking into more unheard of cases, because I did want to cover something that I personally hadn't heard about, and I listen to a lot of true crime, so if I hadn't heard about it, I figured a lot of other people wouldn't have heard about it as well. And I came across this case and this child sex offender serial killer who I hadn't heard of, and who I would assume then that most other people hadn't heard of. And I thought that these 4 innocent young boys deserved their story be told, and I found it so intriguing that I had never heard of this case before. So I decided to cover this, although a solved case, for my first case, and I'll hopefully be back with a couple more cases between now and Christmas. So thank you so much for watching. Please leave any feedback you have below. I do know that the audio in this video probably wasn't the best. When I do film in my apartment at school, I will have a microphone, should have that for the next video, but I don't at the moment, so I'm just working off of the internal mic on the camera. So it may not be great. I will try to play around with it best as I can as I edit for you. And please like and subscribe. Give me a little bit of a trial period if you would like. Watch my next couple videos, see what you think if you liked this one, and I'll see you next time. Bye!